So let me start with a question for you. Does paying extremely high rent just mean you live in a successful city? Or is it a sign that the rules themselves are, well, fundamentally broken?
It's a huge question, and it's one that Matthew Yglesias really tackles in his book, The Rent is Too Damn High.
And because this book makes such a sweeping claim about American life, we believe some books just have to be challenged.
Absolutely. So this critique uses a step-by-step critical thinking framework. We're mapping claims to evidence, drawing on the work of Richard Paul and Linda Elder.
We also apply an intellectual framework from Mortimer J. Adler's work, and we use the Golden Rule, even the U.S. preamble, to find any ethical asymmetries.
And we'll wrap up with a logical analysis for a balanced conclusion. What you're experiencing is a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Our mission here is to really test the author's diagnosis. Do his policy prescriptions actually match the evidence and the ethical goals he's aiming for?
So let's get into that core thesis. The book's big argument is that expensive housing in places people want to live isn't inevitable. It's not like gravity.
No, he calls it a self-inflicted wound, a direct result of restrictive local regulation.
Exactly. Think single-family zoning, height limits that seem almost arbitrary, parking minimums, all these local rules.
And these rules, he says, actively choke off the supply of housing right where demand is highest.
And the fallout from that cascades far beyond just one tenant struggling with rent.
This is where the argument gets really ambitious, right? He connects it to these huge national problems.
He does. He's talking about slowing down the entire country's economic growth.
Literally holding back national output, and at the same time making economic inequality worse by locking people out of high-wage cities.
Forcing everyone else into that unsustainable, car-dependent sprawl we know so well. It's an economic argument, but it's really wrapped in a moral one.
And the style of the book reflects that. It's a polemic, it's designed to argue.
Very declarative. Its real strength is taking standard microeconomics and making it feel personal.
It's that basic logic. If you severely constrain supply,
And demand is just surging because that's where the jobs are.
and the price really only has one direction to go, up.
And that's the engine of what we now call the YMBY thesis.
Yes.
In my backyard.
The idea being that cities like New York, San Francisco, Boston, there are economic engines, but they're running with the brakes on.
Right. If we could just free up building in those high-demand areas, more people could get to those high-productivity jobs.
And the result would be a boost to the entire national economy. It makes a lot of intuitive sense.
It does.
Mm.
But we have to press on the evidence. When you hear these huge claims about national GDP gains, trillions of dollars, some economists estimate you have to ask.
Where's the systematic data to back that up?
And that's a major point of critique. The book, because it's so concise and argumentative, it tends to rely on these stylized specific examples.
So he'll highlight the most absurd zoning rules, the two-story limits, the ridiculous parking requirements.
But it's not a complete systematic survey of data across dozens of different metro areas. The issue isn't that the claims are necessarily wrong, it's that they are sometimes presented as settled fact.
Like the projected magnitude of those GDP gains, it's treated as if it's already a verified number.
Right. And that's the difference between correlation and causation. It weakens the overall argument that zoning is this single, overwhelmingly dominant cause of the housing crisis.
It makes the argument feel almost too simple.
Exactly. Fix zoning, problem solved. But that really downplays other factors. What about the cost of construction? Labor, materials, just buying the land.
Those costs are still incredibly high, even if you loosen the zoning rules.
And a comprehensive diagnosis has to engage with those factors just as rigorously.
So let's pivot from the evidence to the philosophy. This is where we can ask that Adler-style question. Does the author distinguish between what's plausible and what's actually been proven?
And that is the critical leap the book makes. It moves so smoothly from the very well-supported point that regulations raise prices at the margin.
To the much, much bigger conclusion that fixing those regulations would largely solve the affordability crisis.
And that distinction is everything. It takes deregulation from being one tool in the toolbox,
And makes it the central, almost moral imperative of the entire debate.
which then sets the stage for the ethical side of this. And to be fair, the book has real moral force. It deserves a lot of credit for putting renters and low-income workers at the center of the story.
It frames exclusionary zoning not as some benign local choice, but as incumbent homeowners using the law to push costs onto other people.
People who are locked out of opportunity.
And if you apply the golden rule there, treat others as you want to be treated, the implication is really powerful.
It is. If affluent residents just applied that standard, I deserve access to opportunity, to everyone else, how could they defend rules that maintain exclusion?
It's a great moral challenge for people who benefit from that scarcity.
It is. However, a full ethical assessment also has to ask whose risks are being minimized in the story. And this is where we find a really crucial asymmetry.
Meaning, the book doesn't give as much sustained thought to the fears of people already living in these neighborhoods.
Exactly. We're talking about working-class communities, historically marginalized communities. Their fears of displacement, of cultural erasure, those are justified.
They've already faced disproportionate burdens from past development, like highway construction.
That's right. So the harm to the person who can't move into a city is fully explored, as it should be. But the harm to the current resident who might get priced out of a neighborhood they've lived in for generations, that gets far less analysis.
So if we test this against the values in the U.S., preamble justice, domestic tranquility, general welfare.
The book is very strong on general welfare. It's all about economic efficiency and growth.
But it's much thinner on domestic tranquility and justice, at least as they relate to neighborhood stability and local voice.
The critical need is to figure out how to liberalize zoning while also constraining that kind of speculative displacement that can just wreck a vulnerable community.
And that balance feels a bit missing from the central argument.
It does. And speaking of awareness, this seems like a good moment to pause and reflect. Mindful Moments, which is our YouTube channel that animates this kind of critique, offers AI book analysis, summaries, and podcasts. They're all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought.
So we encourage you to just take a second and consider your own housing story.
Think about the rules you probably never voted on, that have constrained or enabled your own life. The real power of this book, even with its gaps, is teaching you to see a local zoning board not as some boring technical body,
But as a site of profound moral and economic consequence, it turns bureaucracy into a national battlefield.
Okay, so let's get into the policy prescriptions. Yglesias' main solution is very direct.
Simple, even. Just relax the zoning constraints, especially height limits and parking minimums.
Let developers build more apartments, more townhomes, more mixed-use buildings in those high-demand areas. Flood the market with supply.
And he's pretty skeptical of the alternatives.
Very skeptical. He sees things like rent control or heavily subsidized affordable housing programs as just treating symptoms.
Right. They address the high prices, but they leave the underlying disease, the actual shortage of homes, completely untouched.
He makes a good point. If you mandate that, say, 20% of units in a new building must be affordable, but you only allow one small building to get built every 5 years.
You haven't solved the problem. You've just slightly eased a tiny fraction of the pain while the overall shortage gets worse.
But in the spirit of looking at rival viewpoints, there is significant pushback.
Critics who say that focusing only on supply misses a key point.
That construction and land costs are just so high in big cities that even new market rate housing might not be affordable for middle-income families, let alone the working poor.
That's a real challenge. If a single apartment costs $1 million to build, changing the zoning from 3 stories to 4 doesn't suddenly make it affordable for someone earning minimum wage.
And then there are other critics, especially those focused on neighborhood equity. They warn that rapid upzoning without strong tenant protections can actually make gentrification worse in the short term. Land values shoot up instantly, just on the anticipation of new density. That puts crushing pressure on the existing, older, unsubsidized rental housing next door.
So the critique is that the book dismisses these other viewpoints a bit too quickly.
Right, without really exploring hybrid policies. Policies that try to bridge that gap between building more and protecting people.
What would a hybrid policy even look like?
Things like inclusionary zoning, where you require affordable units, but you pair it with significant density bonuses so the project is still profitable.
Okay, so the trade-off.
Or targeted public housing built right in those opportunity zones. And things like community land trusts, which take land off the speculative market forever to ensure permanent affordability.
So these solutions accept the need for more supply, but they also build in ethical guardrails.
It makes the solution a lot more complicated than just deregulate and build.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a subtle logical risk in the book's premise.
The author often frames building more in rich cities as what economists call a Pareto improvement.
Meaning it's good for everyone. No one loses. He points to better transit, shorter commutes, a bigger tax base, all good things.
But if you look closely at who gains and who loses, it starts to look a lot more like a zero-sum game.
It does. Who might lose? Well, incumbent homeowners. Their main asset, their home's value, is often tied directly to the scarcity created by current zoning.
Their retirement might be banked on that scarcity-driven value.
And what about tenants? The long-term benefit is a cooler rental market, sure, but the short-term risk is displacement. If the building next door gets torn down for a luxury high-rise, the immediate pressure is immense.
And the book doesn't always explicitly own up to that fundamental trade-off.
Right. But confronting that trade-off, owning the political costs, that's where the book's argument really pushes you toward a sharper moral judgment.
It forces you to ask a really powerful personal question.
It does.
When you oppose new housing in your neighborhood, and your reasons might sound good, like preserving neighborhood character or worrying about parking, are you protecting a legitimate interest? Or are you, maybe quietly, using the state's power to privilege your own comfort over someone else's entire life chances?
That question is the book's most powerful civic contribution. So, as an argument, the rent is too damn high is coherent. It's basic economics, constrained supply, demand is high, prices go up. It connects that to big national issues effectively.
Where it falls a little short is in the evidential depth and systematic engagement with why these rules exist in the first place and the ethical constraints we've been talking about, especially displacement.
But as a civic intervention, it succeeds remarkably. It completely reframes housing as a central policy battlefield. It makes the case that local choices can add up to a national injustice.
So a balanced verdict would be this. The book is a compelling, even essential opening brief for pro-housing reform. It deserves to be read.
But it has to be supplemented. You need deeper empirical work and a much thicker ethical and distributional analysis before you could ever treat it as a standalone blueprint for national policy.
This critique applies a structured nonfiction framework that maps the book's claims to their evidential and logical support. It draws on the critical thinking work of Richard Paul and Linda Elder and uses the ethical lenses associated with Mortimer Adler, the Golden Rule, and the values of the U.S. preamble to identify moral asymmetries.
It relies on a range of independent discussions and reviews from publishers, reviewers, and policy commentators rather than reproducing any protected text out of respect for intellectual property and copyright.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis, then subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.